So this summer I spent almost 4 weeks in Indonesia on several different islands. I went to Bali, Lombok, Flores, and spent some time in between Lombok and Flores in the Komodo Islands and some of Sumbawa. And I had an amazing trip. It was so much fun, and just a really beautiful country to visit. Lots of great nature and culture and food. And I want to share a little bit how I planned my trip and what it was like solo traveling in Indonesia, and just share some tips and tricks of how to book stuff, where to book stuff, how much things cost, and all that sort of stuff. Hello, hello! Welcome back. So this is actually filmed a lot later. I got back from Indonesia about, I think, 2 months ago at this point. I got back in August and it's now, actually it's January, so it's been a while. But it took me a while to kind of get all the information together for this video, so I hope that this is in some way informative and helpful if you're planning a solo traveling trip in Indonesia. So the first thing when you're starting a trip is deciding on how much time you have and how much money you have. So those are the basic parameters that I usually base my trips around. And in this case, I had about a month, and I had saved up money for the past couple of years specifically for this purpose. So I had 2,000 euros or US dollars set aside for this trip. I didn't use all of that in the end, but that was sort of my maximum budget that I could use. For Indonesia in general, I budgeted about 40 US dollars per day, which includes accommodation, food, and drink for a relatively budget hostel traveler. So if you wanted to stay in nicer accommodations than I did, or eat out expensive Western food all the time, you would probably need a bigger budget. But I did eat out for every meal, and I stayed in very highly rated hostel dormitory beds. For accommodation, I budgeted about 8 to 10 US dollars per night, which is what I ended up paying for each hostel bed, and there were some great hostels in Indonesia. I think my favorite ones were Bochan Hostel in Kuta on Lombok, just had a really nice social vibe, and then Siesta in Labuan Bajo on Flores, and finally the Farm in Canggu. Had this like great pool, and yeah, just also really nice people staying there. I really enjoyed that. In general, there's like a nice hostel culture in Indonesia. I'd say it's really appropriate for solo travel. I usually book about 2 nights ahead if I'm traveling to a new destination, and then I'll spend the 2 nights in that first hostel, and if I like it, I'll stay, and if not, I'll move around. But the 2-night rule kind of gives me time to get settled and not be worried about not having a place to stay on the first night. I generally use Booking.com and Hostelworld to book my hostels, and for Indonesia, most hostels were a little bit cheaper on Booking.com, so that's what I ended up using, and they were often cancelable right up till the night before, so that's really useful if you're sort of changing plans on the go. There's also lots of cute hotels and bungalow places to stay in if you were traveling as a couple, for example. There were loads of places that were about 20 US dollars a night, so 10 US dollars per person. It's almost the same as a nice hostel bed, so I would have definitely taken advantage of that if I'd been traveling with a partner. To get around in Indonesia, your really only main option is renting a scooter, which luckily is really cheap and easy to do everywhere. You do need to bring an international license according to the rules, but I was never checked for this, never asked for it. But it is the rule, and if you're stopped by the police, you're meant to have an international license on you. You can also get around via taxis, either motorbike taxis or car taxis. And there's a bunch of apps that run services, so there's Gojek, Uber, and Bluebird Taxi are the main ones that I used. And then of course there all are regular local taxis, but I just found it kind of safer and easier to go with one of those companies that you can book via an app, just for payment and then there's no need to haggle for the price, etc. And just for a reference point, it usually cost me about 14,000 Indonesian rupiah for 10 minutes on a motorbike taxi with the Gojek app, and that's about €1, so it's very, very affordable. I didn't ever take the bus or the train while I was in Indonesia. I'm not sure if that's really a service that's widely available. Maybe on Java it is, or other larger islands, but on the islands I visited, I didn't ever see public transport. One tip that I would advise is to download the apps for those taxis that I mentioned before you arrive in Indonesia, just so like when you get off the plane, you can book a taxi immediately without the hassle and no need for a SIM card immediately, etc. I would say that a lot of accommodations are willing to arrange airport transport for you, but in my experience, when I triple checked the prices, it was often more expensive to do this than just arrange my own transportation, so I usually ended up doing my own. In terms of internet, there's great SIM cards available in Indonesia for very, very cheap. Loads of little convenience store type places sell them, and they're in general very easily available in the more touristy areas. I would just ask around a little bit before you buy one because different shops have very different prices for things, so it's just good to get a feel for how much it should cost. When you get a SIM card, you do need a passport on you for them to register the SIM card, so keep that in mind when you're going out to buy one. So in terms of Indonesian food, I really enjoyed trying all the different local specialties. There's a bit less variety in my experience than in Indian cooking, for example, which is one of my personal favorites. But there was still a lot to try and great options for cheap street food or restaurant food, either Indonesian or Western, which tended to be more expensive. So sort of the basic local dishes are nasi goreng and mie goreng, which is either fried noodles or fried rice, and that's just a really cheap and easy staple to get anywhere pretty much. And another meal that I had a lot is called nasi campur, and it's just a kind of a buffet style meal where you go up to a counter usually and there's a bunch of dishes that have been cooked usually earlier in the day, and then you choose a mix and match of the meats and the rices and the tofu, and it ends up being very cheap, about $4 per nasi campur, and you get a lot of different things, so that's really fun. On Lombok, the food was a lot spicier than on Bali, which I really enjoyed because I love spicy food, but I think the food can vary quite a lot depending on what island you're on. And luckily, Indonesia is actually very vegan and vegetarian friendly in my experience because tofu and tempeh are a big part of the national cuisine, which is great.
So while we're crushing the peanut, we need to add water, little by little.
Oh, 1 second. One more friend.
Thank you.
For going out in Indonesia, it's more of a laid-back surfer vibe. Bintang beer, local beer, can be really cheap, but any other drink is usually quite pricey comparatively to other things that you'll be buying while traveling in Indonesia, so I didn't go out too much. I felt pretty safe going out as well as a female traveler, and there were always a few people from the hostel doing social things in the evening. So it's definitely possible, but I wouldn't say that it's like the biggest party place ever unless you go to specific party hotspots like Gili Tea. Also, it is worth mentioning that a lot of Indonesia is predominantly Muslim, so it can be hard to find alcohol. To sort of finish off this video, I wanted to go through my itinerary and everywhere I went on this trip. It's quite a mix and match of things because I did some solo traveling, I did a guided tour situation, and I also traveled with my family all on the same go. I arrived in Indonesia from Singapore, so it wasn't too long of a flight. And then I spent one night in Canggu, which is quite close to the airport, so I would recommend that as a first destination. I stayed in the Farm, which was a great hostel, and I went to a concert with some people from the hostel randomly. I wanted to surf, but the waves that day in Canggu were really big, and that was just a bit intimidating to me as my first day back to surfing, so I decided to skip that. The next day, my family arrived and I took a taxi down to Uluwatu to meet them at the villa that we had rented. So we stayed in a villa for, I think, 3 nights in Uluwatu, and it's quite a surfer type area, and we just went out to all the hipster cafes and had nice brunches and coffees and smoothies. Yeah, I think surfing and brunching is sort of the main thing that people do in Uluwatu, and it's quite a famous place to watch pro surfers, so I did that as well. After that, we went up to Ubud, which is sort of a bit more north into the country. It's very green, surrounded by a lot of green, and it's a very popular place to go. While we were there, we mainly did yoga, got massages, and sort of explored the city and the surrounding rice fields. I did really enjoy our time in Ubud, and I like that we had 5 days, so we really had time to explore both the city and the surroundings, but it was really crowded and full of traffic, and I think if I went back to Bali, I would not go to Ubud again. I'd go somewhere even farther north that's less visited, because I felt like Ubud was just a bit overrun. But despite all that, it is a great base for seeing things in the region, so I still wouldn't not go there, but it wasn't my favorite place. So after Ubud, we drove down to Sanur, which is a place where there's a lot of ferries that go to the islands that are near Bali. So we took a ferry to Nusa Lembongan, which is one of the 3 Nusa islands. We stayed there for 4 nights at a beautiful bungalowy hotel that I can link below, and the owners were so sweet and kind. I would really recommend staying there. And during that time, we just rented bicycles and we explored Nusa Lembongan, which is a sort of seaweed farmer island that was quite quiet when we were there. It's kind of been overtaken by its neighbor Nusa Penida, which is famous on Instagram now. But I really enjoyed the quiet on Nusa Lembongan, and we actually rode our bikes over to Nusa Ceningan, which is the island in the middle, and it's so small and so close that you can just ride your bike over there in about half an hour. So we did that, and we found this hotel on top of a hill that had a giant infinity pool that we could use if we bought a drink at the hotel, so we did that. It was the best view ever. yeah, after a few days on the nice beaches in Nusa Lembongan, my family had to go back home and I took a ferry to Gili Air. Which is one of the 3 Gili Islands. And Gili Air is known to be a mix of the other two, so a little bit partyish but also a little bit relaxing with some great snorkeling. I met a lovely woman from France while I was there, and we went snorkeling together and went out that night and met some more French people, and I got to practice my French, which I hadn't used in a while. Yeah, and I really enjoyed Gili Air. I think I should have stayed there a lot longer if I had time, but it just didn't work for my itinerary because I was just stopping over before starting a boat trip that I had pre-booked. It was a 4-day, 3-night live-aboard cruise from Lombok to Flores via the Komodo Islands. I made a whole video about that trip, so please check that out. It was one of the best experiences I've ever done while traveling. It was so much fun, so worth the money, and I just made incredible friends, and I'm so glad I did that. So yeah, please check out the video on that. I won't expand too much on it here, but I would recommend something like that if you're going to Indonesia, or this area of Indonesia. And then after that boat trip, I landed in Labuan Bajo in Flores, which is farther east in Indonesia, and I stayed there for a night in one of my favorite hostels ever, the Siesta Hostel, and partied with the friends that I had made on the boat, and then I had to fly back the next day to Lombok on a flight that I had pre-booked. Yeah, I spent the next week on Lombok in Kuta, the surfer village in the south, and I just went surfing every day, and I enjoyed the great coffees and the very laid-back vibe of Kuta on Lombok, which is not Kuta on Bali. It was one of my favorite places. I think if I went back to Indonesia, I would hightail it to Kuta on Lombok. And after surfing around for a few days, I took a car up north to Senaru, where I slept for a night before starting a 3-day trek up to Mount Rinjani, which is the volcano on Lombok, or one of the volcanoes. And that's also quite a popular thing to do, and I did really enjoy it, but I don't think that it really lived up to the hype. It was also one of the more expensive things I did because you have to pay for a guide and porters to get up the mountain. But still, a lot of people do enjoy it, and I did have a great time. It was just not worth the money for me. So then I went back down and I went to spend the night in Senggigi, which is on the west coast of Lombok, for one night. And one of my favorite things that I did there is renting a scooter and driving along the coastal road, sort of on the rim of the island. That was so beautiful and worth doing. But other than that, I didn't enjoy Senggigi. It was quite dead and empty, and I think maybe COVID had something to do with that, but it just wasn't a place where I felt sort of safe as a tourist, and there weren't a lot of other hostile people around, so I ended up actually cancelling my hotel and driving the long way on the back of a Gojek back down to Kuta to spend the last night with the friends that I had made in the hostel there. And then the next day, I packed up all my stuff, forgot my bathing suit, had to go back for that, and took a taxi back to the airport, and I flew via Jakarta and via Singapore back home. And that was the end of my trip in Indonesia. I had a really good time, and I hope that this video sort of helps you make an itinerary for going there for about 3 weeks to a month, if that's of interest to you. There are so many more places to go in Indonesia. Next time I go, I really want to go to Sumbawa more, and also to, what is it called? Oh my goodness, I forgot. The island up north, like in the very west, that's very big and it starts with an S. I don't know, but there's a lot of jungle there and I want to go there. If you're a first-time traveler to Indonesia, I really recommend Lombok. It's less touristy than Bali, but not at all hard to navigate as a traveler. There's still a lot of hostel culture. Yeah, I hope this video inspired you for some traveling. Thank you so much for watching my videos, and I hope that you stick around for some more travel videos in the future. Bye!